Over the last nearly 11 months now, our attention has unsurprisingly mostly been on Gaza. That's where, of course, the focus has been of Israel's genocidal onslaught. Israel's wiping out of much of Gaza's infrastructure from the face of the earth, the mass slaughter of tens of thousands of its people. We could go on. But we shouldn't forget the West Bank, which is where over 3 million Palestinian citizens live. That's an even bigger Palestinian population than Gaza's pre-war population. Now, the West Bank has been under direct Israeli military occupation since 1967 as part of the longest belligerent occupation in modern human history. And in praxis, Israel has long been illegally annexing the West Bank. Now, as the International Court of Justice, the highest court on earth, recently ruled, the West Bank is under illegal Israeli occupation. It endorsed what international and Israeli human rights organisations have said for a long time, that a system of apartheid is enforced there. Now, there are around 700,000 Israeli settlers living there in around 150 illegal settlements and 128 illegal outposts. And even before the 7th of October, the Palestinian population were being terrorised. In 2023, before the 7th of October, around 240 Palestinians that year, in the first 3 quarters, had been killed by Israeli security forces and settlers. Around 40 of them were children. But since the 7th of October, there has been a pogrom waged against the Palestinian population in the West Bank, with over 600 Palestinians being killed since then, around 146 of them children, which is itself 4 times as many Israeli children killed on the 7th of October. Obviously, countless thousands of Palestinian children and tens of thousands overall of Palestinian civilians have been killed in Gaza since the 7th of October. Meanwhile, Israeli forces have razed hundreds of homes in the West Bank to the ground and displaced thousands of Palestinians from their homes and seized around 37,000 acres of Palestinian land. We've seen settlers on the rampage waging terrorist attacks against the Palestinian population, described as terrorism even by the head of Israel's security agency, the Shin Bet, leading to denunciations from Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. In practice, the settlers' reign of terror is facilitated, enabled, protected by the illegal Israeli military occupation and apparatus. Now, today the Israeli state has launched an invasion of the occupied West Bank. According to the Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz, this is an attack on terrorist infrastructure. Well, we've heard that before and we've seen the consequences. But he also said something very striking. He said, we must deal with the threat just as we deal with the terrorist infrastructure in Gaza, including the temporary evacuation of Palestinian residents or whatever steps are required. This is a war for everything and we must win it. As Palestinians have learned with much bitterness over and over again since 1948, being driven from their home is anything but temporary. This is, again, ethnic cleansing. Indeed, the foreign minister here is explicitly stating that the West Bank must be dealt with the same as Gaza. The Gazification of the West Bank therefore may beckon. This is the biggest Israeli military offensive in the illegally occupied West Bank in nearly 2 decades, in the midst that was back then of the Second Intifada. At least 10 Palestinians have reportedly been killed today. There have been airstrikes, including on Monday, with strikes on the Nur Shams refugee camp, in which children, amongst others, were killed. The United Nations warns that the situation in the occupied West Bank could worsen dramatically if the Israeli security forces continue to systematically use unlawful, lethal force, note they said unlawful, and ignore violence perpetrated by the settlers. Let's listen to the Palestinian-American analyst Omar Badr, who I've interviewed on this channel.
What do you make of this military operation?
Yeah, I think the context of it is worth noting, which is the fact that Israel has been intending to annex and ethnically cleanse huge parts of the West Bank for a very, very long time. And in fact, has been actively doing that in slow motion. And I think that they saw an opportunity, given that the world is distracted by the horror that Israel is unleashing on Gaza, to kind of escalate in the West Bank. And so what we've seen over the past several months is more than 650 Palestinians being killed by Israeli soldiers and settlers throughout the West Bank. In any other context, this would be a crisis that everybody would be talking about, but only in the shadow of the genocide that Israel is unleashing on Gaza has this kind of passed without people really paying attention. And naturally, whenever you see this kind of violence unfold, there's going to be resistance to it, and in some cases, violent resistance as well. And now Israel sees itself as somehow compelled to launch this military operation. seemingly under this delusion that has been disproven over and over again, that you can somehow kill and torture and maim and imprison and suppress and oppress Palestinians into some kind of victory out of all this. But this is really the same tape being played over and over again. And it's a recipe that will lead to endless violence and bloodshed until there is a fundamental change in Israel's attitude towards Palestinians.
And what about the timing of this particular raid? I mean, should we be reading anything into that?
I think Israel is under tremendous pressure of the fact that they are stuck in Gaza without a strategic victory. They promised that they would be able to defeat Hamas quickly, that they would be able to free the hostages. They've been able to achieve neither of these things. In the north, they're stuck in a status quo where they're supposed to restore their deterrence and intimidate Hezbollah across the Lebanon border. They have failed miserably at that. And I think whenever Israel finds itself cornered and is in desperate need for a victory for its public, all they know how to do is unleash indiscriminate violence against Palestinians. And this is the playbook that they actually go to. And I think that this is the moment that we find ourselves in, is that Netanyahu is desperate for some sort of image of an accomplishment. And he thinks by launching this massive, large-scale operation in the West Bank, in which, relatively speaking, given the dynamics under occupation, Israel can claim some sort of victory out of at the end of this, that this is somehow going to play well for Netanyahu politically and try to salvage an image that has been completely tarnished over the past 10 months.
Well, indeed, the genocidal onslaught against Gaza has slaughtered so many Palestinians, unleashed so much destruction amidst some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century, but it's also failed on its own terms. All Israel knows what to do in these circumstances is to further export more violence. Now let's listen to Mustafa Barghouti. He's a Palestinian politician who, again, has been interviewed on this channel.
Can we just get your take on how troubling these raids are? Israel's foreign minister describing it as a war. What has been the reaction there, first of all?
Well, these are not just raids. It's a huge military operation. It's actually an act of war that is taking place, invading 4 major areas. But not only that, they are invading so many communities and villages all over the West Bank to arrest people. The most important thing here for the audience to understand is that the West Bank is an occupied territory by the Israeli army. We've been under Israeli military occupation since 57 years. And what Israel is doing now is conducting a war on occupied people, which is a total violation of any international law that rules how an occupying power should behave. They are using airstrikes, they are using air force, they are using tanks, they are using bulldozers. And what they try to do now in the West Bank is to transfer the acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing that they are doing in Gaza into the West Bank. And that is all done by this Israeli fascist government, which is run by illegal settlers like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are trying to destroy the whole infrastructure of these areas. And their goal is clear. Katz, the foreign minister of Israel, has just declared that ethnic cleansing should be conducted of the cities of the West Bank, including these refugee camps.
So, well, there we go. Absolutely. Gratuitous violations of international law, but Israel has the protection of the world's hegemon, the United States, and so is treated as being above international law. Now, in terms of settlers, and there are obviously huge numbers of settlers in the West Bank. Now, let's listen to a settler from Texas, the United States, who wishes to settle illegally on an annexed and ethnically cleansed Gaza. She was interviewed on Channel 4 News.
The idea of you coming from America to here, settling in potentially in Gaza, kicking Palestinians out, a lot of people would see that as settler colonialism.
It's not really colonialism, it's a return. My grandparents were kicked out of Israel by Arabs who were trying to establish a Palestinian state, and they had to leave for their survival, and I'm just coming back and fulfilling their dream. That would be the first thing. The second thing is, I think that, and I know this is a minority view, I think colonialism gets a bad rap. Like, genocide is bad, but colonizing places that are genocidal and they have bad ideology, it's good to come in and correct their views.
What do you think should happen to the people who are already in Gaza?
So I think that there's a couple of possibilities. The one that I think is the most realistic is we got to ask other countries for help. I know that Spain was willing to take a couple of million. I know Russia said they would take a couple of thousand.
To a lot of people, that would sound like you're advocating for ethnic cleansing.
I don't think so, because Palestinian isn't an ethnicity, it's an ideology, and it's an ideology that says that they want Jews dead, and so we want them as far away from Jews as possible.
The rictus grin at the end there. Shudder. You can hear the mentality there which drives Israeli settler colonialism, and indeed a genocidal mentality, which is that Palestinian is not real. That to be a Palestinian is an ideology that says they want Jews dead, therefore basically portraying, defining Palestinians as an existential menace. Throughout history, we know what happens when entire peoples are defined as an existential menace. That is always a precondition for genocide, which is, again, the world turned upside down when she talks about genocidal mentality. But again, we've seen this throughout history. The Hutu extremists, when they murdered the Tutsis in the Rwandan genocide, justified that on the basis that the Tutsis would commit genocide against the Hutus unless they killed them first. Now, she talks about indigenous Palestinians who've lived on this land for generations, centuries even, as she moves there from Texas. It is clear that the Israeli state wants to drive the Palestinian population out of Gaza and out of the West Bank. What you hear from that settler, as extreme as it sounds, is merely an honest exposition of what the Israeli state is seeking. The Israeli state will, in practice, slaughter those who do not leave in a genocidal frenzy, slaughter, terrorise, you name it. All of this is enabled and indeed facilitated by the US and key Western allies, and unless it is fought, the genocidal mayhem we've seen in Gaza is only going to be the beginning. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your thoughts, your comments, as ever. Do help keep the show on the road at patreon.com/OwenJones84. Listen to the podcast. Speak to you soon.